You've heard 100 stories about people saving animals. They blur together after a while, the rescue, the tears, the swelling music you can almost hear behind the words. I know. I used to skip past them too. But I'm going to ask you to stay for this one. Not because I'm a good storyteller, I'm not. Ask anyone who's tried to sit through one of my ramblings at the feed store. I'm asking because I was there. I saw it with my own two eyes, and I still don't have a clean explanation for what happened. There are things I watched unfold on that dry stretch of nothing land that I have turned over in my head every single night since, and I am no closer to understanding them. A man paid $2 for a buffalo that everyone, including me, had already written off as dead. $2, less than a cup of coffee. And what came back to him months later broke something open in me that I didn't know was still shut. I'm not going to tell you the ending yet. That would be cheating and you'd never believe me anyway. Let me start where it started, in the heat with the flies, with a smell I still can't scrub out of my memory. Stay with me. I promise you it goes somewhere you won't expect. The first time I saw Wesley Boone, he was on his knees in the dirt, and I thought he was praying. He wasn't. He was listening to a buffalo breathe. I'd pulled my truck off the county road because I saw the auction lot flags snapping in the wind and figured I'd kill an hour looking at livestock I couldn't afford. That's the honest truth of how I came to be there, boredom and a half tank of gas. I keep a little notebook in my shirt pocket, always have, a habit my father called a nuisance and my ex-wife called worse. I write down what I see. Weather prices, the way a man holds his hat when he's lying. That afternoon I wrote 3 words before anything else happened: dust, heat, him. Him being Wesley, though I didn't know his name yet. The auction wasn't much of an auction. It was the kind they hold at the tail end of a bad drought season, where ranchers cull the animals they can't feed through winter, and everybody pretends the low prices are somebody else's fault. There were maybe 40 people scattered across the lot, most of them there for the same reason I was: nothing better to do. The good stock had sold in the morning. By afternoon, what was left standing in the pens was the sad arithmetic of a hard year. Old cows with hips like coat hangers, a blind mule, a few goats nobody wanted. And then there was the buffalo. They'd put her, I learned later it was a her, in a separate pen off to the side, the way you set aside a thing you're embarrassed to be selling. She was down on her side in the mud, and she was not getting up. Her ribs pushed against her hide with every breath like something trying to escape a too small room. There were open sores on her hindquarters where she'd been lying too long. Flies moved over her in a black shifting sheet. One of her eyes was crusted shut. The other one was open, and it was looking at nothing. I've been around dying animals my whole life. You learn to recognize the specific stillness of a creature that has stopped fighting. This buffalo had that stillness. She'd already left, mostly. Her body just hadn't caught up to the news. The auctioneer, a red-faced man named Delbert who I'd seen work a dozen of these sad little sales, didn't even bother with his usual patter. He stood at the rail of her pen and said, flat as a griddle, "We got the bison cow. She's well. You can see what she is." A ripple of dry laughter went through the crowd. "Somebody take her off my hands. $1 to start." Nobody moved. You have to understand what that silence meant. It wasn't cruelty exactly, though I won't pretend there wasn't some of that in it. It was math. Buying that animal meant paying for the hauling, paying for the burying, paying to dispose of 1,000+ pounds of dead weight that would be dead weight in the most literal sense within a day or two. Nobody buys a problem like that on purpose. The mercy, if you could call it that, was to leave her unsold so the auction house would deal with her. The kindest thing anyone in that crowd thought they could do was nothing. "Dollar," Delbert said again without hope. "Anybody, she's a fine rug at least." More laughter. I confess I might have smiled myself. It's easier to smile than to look at the thing you're smiling about. That's when Wesley Boone raised his hand. I noticed him because he didn't do it the way you bid at an auction, no confident flick of the wrist, no catching the auctioneer's eye. He raised his whole arm slowly, The way a boy in the back of a classroom raises his hand when he's not sure of the answer but can't stand the silence anymore. $2, he said. Delbert squinted at him. $2, Wesley said again. Son, you know what you're bidding on. I do. Delbert looked around the crowd like he was waiting for someone to explain the joke to him. When nobody did, he shrugged, the way you shrug at a man determined to make his own mistakes. $2 once, twice, sold to the fella who's about to regret it. He banged his little gavel against the rail and it made a sound like a knuckle knocking on a coffin. God help you. And that was it. That's how Wesley Boone bought a dying buffalo for $2 on a Thursday afternoon in the worst part of a bad year. I should have gotten back in my truck. I want you to know I thought about it. I had no dog in this fight, no reason to stay, and every reason to think I was about to watch something ugly and pointless. A stubborn man kneeling in the mud beside an animal that was going to die no matter what he did, wasting his afternoon and his $2 on a gesture that would change nothing. But I've spent my whole life leaving before the interesting part. 61 years of turning the truck around. And something about the way that man had raised his hand, slow, uncertain, like he was scared of his own decision even as he made it, pinned my boots to the ground. So I stayed. I got out my notebook, and I watched Wesley Boone crawl into that pen. He didn't rush her. That was the first thing that struck me. A younger man, or a stupider one, might have grabbed at the buffalo, tried to haul her up, done something loud and useless. Wesley did none of that. He came into the pen low and slow on his hands and knees, and he stopped several feet away and just sat. In the mud. In the flies. In that smell that I promise you would have driven most people back over the rail. He sat down cross-legged like a man settling in for a long conversation, and he waited. The buffalo's one open eye rolled toward him. She couldn't lift her head, but she watched him. Hey, Wesley said, just that. Hey now. I edged closer to the rail so I could hear. Delbert was already dragging his rickety podium toward his truck, the auction over, everyone else drifting back to their vehicles with the particular haste of people who don't want to watch what happens next. In a few minutes it was just me at the rail, and Wesley in the pen, and the buffalo. I know, he said to her in a voice so low I almost missed it. I know you're tired. I've thought a lot about those words since. I know you're tired. Not you're going to be okay. Not hang on. He didn't lie to her. He didn't promise her anything. He just told her he understood, and somehow that was the thing that made me get out my pen. He talked to her for a long time. I couldn't hear most of it. It wasn't for me anyway. Occasionally I caught a word, her breathing, her ribs, easy, easy, easy. Once I saw him reach out, painfully slowly, and rest one flat hand against her shoulder just above where the sores began. She flinched. He held still. She stopped flinching. His hand stayed there for what must have been 10 minutes, and I stood at that rail with my notebook forgotten in my hand, and I watched a man make friends with a dying animal for no reason I could name. The sun was going down behind the pens by the time he stood up. His knees popped. He was mud from the waist down, and there was a smear of something worse on his forearm. He looked at me, the first time he'd acknowledged I existed, and he said, tired, "You know anyone with a stock trailer?" I did, as it happened. I had one myself. I should tell you here that I did not offer it out of the goodness of my heart. I want to be honest in this account because the whole thing depends on honesty, and because I have told it wrong before, made myself the hero of a story I mostly just witnessed. The truth is I offered my trailer because I wanted to know how it ended. That's all. Curiosity, the same thing that had killed my marriage and half my friendships, the inability to walk away from something I didn't understand. I wanted to see whether the buffalo would die in my trailer or his pen. I'm not proud of it, but it's true. I've got one, I said. It's not far. He looked at me a moment longer, and I got the sense he understood exactly why I was offering and didn't hold it against me. I'm Wesley, he said. I know, I lied. I wrote his name down that night so I wouldn't forget it. I've never forgotten it since. Loading a downed buffalo into a stock trailer is a thing I hope you never have to do. It took us until full dark. We used boards and straps and a come-along winch that Wesley produced from the bed of his ancient pickup, and more than once I was certain we were going to kill her in the process, that the strain of moving her would be the thing that finally stopped her heart. She groaned, a sound I still hear sometimes, low and hollow, like wind in a culvert. Wesley talked to her the entire time. Easy, I've got you. Easy now. Almost. Sweat ran off both of us. The flies followed her into the trailer. When we finally got her in and closed the gate, we both stood there in the dark, breathing hard, not looking at each other. My shirt was soaked through. My hands were shaking, partly from the work and partly from something else I didn't have a word for. "Why'd you buy her?" I asked him. It came out rougher than I meant it. "You know she's not going to make it." He was quiet for a while. Then he said, "My daughter used to draw them." I didn't understand. "Buffalo," he said. "When she was little, she had a whole notebook full of them. Said they looked like they were carrying something heavy, but they kept walking anyway." He wiped his face with the back of his wrist. "She's gone now. 2 years this spring. Car thing. Wasn't her fault." He said it in the flat, careful way people say the things that have broken them, like each word is a stone they have to set down gently or it'll go off. I saw that animal lying there and I don't know what I thought. I thought somebody ought to sit with her at least, so she's not alone, that's all. I didn't have a plan past that. I didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say. I've buried people too. I know the shape of that silence. $2, he said, and let out a short laugh with no humor in it. "Cheapest thing I ever bought, and it's gonna cost me a fortune." We drove her back to his place that night, my truck pulling the trailer, his headlights following behind me the whole way like a promise he was making to himself. I remember thinking, the entire drive, that I was helping a grieving man do a foolish thing, and that the kindest outcome would be for the buffalo to pass quietly before morning so he could grieve her too and be done with it. I have rarely been so wrong about anything in my life. Wesley's place was 40 acres of hardpan and mesquite at the end of a road the county had mostly forgotten. A double-wide, a leaning barn, a windmill that turned in the dark. Not a rich man's land. The land of a man holding on. We backed the trailer up to the barn and made her a bed of straw and got her out of the trailer with the same agonizing slowness we'd used to get her in. By the time she was down in the straw, it was past midnight. Wesley brought her water in a bucket and held her crusted head up so she could drink, and she did drink a little, a few desperate swallows, and I remember the surprise of it, the way her throat worked. It was the first sign of appetite I'd seen. It didn't mean anything, I told myself. Dying animals drink sometimes. It's just the body. "You can head home," Wesley told me. "You've done enough, more than enough, I mean that." But I didn't head home. I don't fully know why. I sat down on an overturned feed bucket in the doorway of that barn, and Wesley sat down in the straw beside the buffalo, and we passed the rest of the night that way, the three of us, while the windmill creaked and the flies finally went to sleep and the buffalo breathed her ragged, broken breaths in the dark. Somewhere around 3 in the morning, Wesley started talking to her again. About his daughter mostly. Her name was Ada. She'd been 11. She'd wanted to be a veterinarian or an astronaut or the person who names paint colors. She'd changed her mind weekly. She'd been afraid of the dark and unafraid of everything else. He talked about her the way you talk to someone who already knew her, filling in details for the buffalo like the buffalo was an old friend of the family catching up on news. I sat in that doorway and wrote almost none of it down. Some things you don't put in a notebook, you just hold them. Near dawn, the buffalo shifted in the straw, not much, a few inches. She drew her legs up under herself, the way an animal does when it's thinking, maybe, about the possibility of standing. She didn't stand. She was nowhere near standing. But she moved on purpose for the first time since I'd laid eyes on her, and Wesley went very still, and I heard him whisper something I'll never forget. He said, "There you are." Like he'd been waiting for her to come back from somewhere. The sun came up gray and then gold over the mesquite. The buffalo was still breathing. Against every scrap of experience and common sense I possessed, she was still breathing, and she had moved her legs on purpose, and a man who had lost his only daughter was sitting in the straw beside her with tears drying on his dusty face, and something in his eyes I hadn't seen in a grieving person in a long time. Hope, the dangerous kind, the kind that can hurt you worse than the grief. I drove home that morning exhausted and unsettled and certain of exactly one thing. I was going to come back. I had to know what happened. I told myself it was curiosity, same as always. I know better now. It wasn't curiosity that pulled me back down that forgotten county road, day after day, through the strange months that followed. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you what happened when I came back the next morning, and what the buffalo did that made Wesley Boone drop the water bucket and stand there in the doorway of that barn with his hand over his mouth. Because that was just the beginning of the impossible part. When I pulled up to Wesley's barn the next morning, he was standing in the doorway with a water bucket at his feet and his hand pressed over his mouth, and for one terrible second I was sure the buffalo had died in the night. I was wrong about that too. I was wrong about nearly everything in those months. If there's a lesson in any of this, maybe that's it. How little I understood about what living things can do when someone decides not to let them go alone. The buffalo was standing. Not well, not steadily. Her legs shook like a newborn calf's, and she was leaning hard against the barn wall to keep upright, and she looked, honestly, like a bad drawing of a buffalo, all wrong angles and jutting bones. But she was on her feet. The animal I had helped winch into a trailer 36 hours earlier, the animal every rancher at that auction had written off as a rug, was standing in a barn in the morning light, and Wesley Boone was looking at her like she'd walked out of the sea. She got up on her own, he said, not taking his eyes off her. His voice cracked in the middle of it. I came out and she just got up. I didn't help her, she did it herself. I didn't say anything. I got out my notebook and then I put it away again. Some mornings aren't for writing down. I need to tell you about the weeks that followed because the impossible thing, the thing you're waiting for, the thing the title promised, doesn't make sense without them. People want the miracle to be a single moment, a lightning strike. But I was there and I can tell you it wasn't a moment. It was a slog. It was the least miraculous-looking process you ever saw, and that's exactly what made it a miracle. Wesley named her Junebug. He said Ada would have liked it, that Ada had gone through a phase of nomming everything after bugs. Junebug the buffalo, it stuck. Getting Junebug back from the edge was not a matter of love and hope, whatever the greeting cards will tell you. It was a matter of work. Brutal, unglamorous daily work. Her sores had to be cleaned and dressed twice a day, and cleaning a pressure sore on a half-ton animal is a job that will teach you things about yourself. She had a respiratory infection that took 3 courses of antibiotics. Antibiotics Wesley could not afford, that he bought anyway, that I watched him pay for by not fixing his truck and not fixing the windmill and eating, I strongly suspect, a great deal less than a man his size ought to. She was so malnourished that feeding her too fast could have killed her, so it had to be done in careful increments. A science Wesley learned from a large animal vet named Dr. Acaffer, who drove out at cut rates because, she told me once, I've never seen anybody try this hard at something this hopeless, and I wanted to see how it ended. She wasn't the only one. I came out 3-4 times a week. I told myself it was to help, and I did help. I want that on the record. I dressed those sores and hauled that water and lost 11 pounds I didn't have to lose. But the truth is I came because Wesley's place had become the most alive place I knew, and my own house had gotten very quiet in my 61st year. And there is a particular kind of loneliness that only lifts when you're useful to something that needs you. We fell into a rhythm, the two of us and Dr. Acaffer and Junebug. Dawn feedings, wound care, the slow business of coaxing weight back onto a frame that had forgotten how to carry it. Wesley talked to that buffalo constantly, a running low murmur of encouragement and news and half-remembered stories about Ada, and I stopped finding it strange and started finding it necessary, the way you stop hearing a clock until it stops. There were setbacks. I won't pretend it was a clean climb. 3 weeks in, Junebug went down again and wouldn't get up, and her breathing went wet and shallow, and Dr. Akafer came out at 10 at night and stood there with her stethoscope and her face grave and said the words neither of us wanted. You need to be ready. She may not see morning. And Wesley, if she's suffering, you have to be willing to let her go. That's the deal you make. That's the price of this. I watched Wesley's face when she said it. I watched a man who had already lost the one thing he couldn't afford to lose look at the possibility of losing something again, and I understood, standing in that barn, that he had known this was the risk all along, that the $2 had been the cheapest part, that the expensive part was this, caring about a thing that could still die on you, opening yourself back up to a loss you'd barely survived the first time. If she's hurting, Wesley said very quietly, I'll let her go. I won't keep her here to suffer just so I don't have to. He swallowed. But she's not hurting. Look at her. She's fighting. I'm not gonna quit on her while she's still fighting. Junebug saw morning, and the morning after that. And she got up again on the third day, and Dr. Akafer said something under her breath in a language I didn't know and then said, in English, I have no medical explanation for that animal. Here is the thing I've never been able to explain to anyone who wasn't there. As Junebug got stronger, Wesley got, I don't know the right word, lighter. He'd carried his grief for 2 years the way a man carries a heavy pack he's forgotten he's wearing, and somewhere in the daily work of keeping that buffalo alive, he set some of it down. I watched it happen in pieces. The first time I heard him laugh, really laugh, at Junebug knocking over a feed bucket and looking offended about it. I nearly dropped what I was holding, because I realized I'd known the man 3 weeks and never once heard the sound. He started sleeping, he told me. He hadn't been before. He started eating at the table instead of standing at the counter. He fixed the windmill finally once the vet bills eased. He put a photograph of Ada up on the barn wall where Junebug could see it, which made no sense and made perfect sense, and he'd point Junebug at it sometimes and say, that's her. That's who you remind me of. Always looked like she was carrying something heavy and kept walking anyway. I wrote in my notebook one night, he didn't save the buffalo. The buffalo is saving him. I don't think he knows it yet. I don't think it matters if he knows. But I'm not a sentimental man, and I want to be careful here, because the sentimental version of this story is a lie. It's tempting to say the love did it, that Wesley's grief and hope and gentle words pulled Junebug back from death. And maybe some of that's true. There's things between a man and an animal that science hasn't got instruments for. But mostly what pulled Junebug back was antibiotics and clean wounds, and a man getting up at 4 in the morning for 11 weeks straight to feed her small, careful meals. The miracle wasn't magic. The miracle was that a broken man chose, every single day, to do the hard, unmagical thing, when everyone including himself expected him to fail. That's a harder kind of miracle to believe in. It's the only kind I've ever actually seen. By late summer, Junebug was a buffalo again. I mean that. If you'd walked up to Wesley's fence in August, you'd have seen a healthy young bison cow grazing in a green paddock, glossy and thick and strong, and you would never in 1,000 years have guessed she'd once been $2 worth of dying animal in an auction pen. Her sores had healed to pale scars under new hair. She'd put on hundreds of pounds. She had opinions now. She hated the sound of the county road grader. She loved having her pole scratched. She followed Wesley around the paddock like an enormous dog. She was, Dr. Akafer confirmed on her last visit, completely, improbably healthy. You did something I'll be telling other vets about for the rest of my career, she told Wesley, packing her bag. I want you to understand how rare this is. Animals in her condition don't come back. They just don't. What you did, she shook her head. I don't have a word for it. Wesley did the thing he always did when someone praised him, which was to deflect it onto the buffalo. She did the coming back. I just held the water bucket. That was Wesley all over. In all the months I knew him, I never once heard him take credit for the thing he'd done. It genuinely didn't occur to him that he'd done anything. He thought he'd simply refused to leave, and that refusing to leave wasn't an accomplishment, was just decency, was just what you did. I have thought about that a great deal, about how the man who performed the most extraordinary act of persistence I've ever witnessed believed, sincerely, that he'd done nothing worth mentioning, about how the people who save us rarely know they're doing it, because to them it's just Tuesday, just the next thing, just the water bucket. I want to tell you about one evening near the end of that summer, because it's the last ordinary evening before the impossible thing happened, and I've come to think of it as the last chapter of the first story before the second story began. We were sitting on the tailgate of Wesley's newly fixed truck, watching Junebug graze in the gold light. It was the kind of evening the drought had made us forget was possible, a little cool, a little green, the smell of cut hay somewhere and dust settling. Wesley had a beer he wasn't really drinking. I had my notebook I wasn't really writing in. "You ever think about what happens now?" I asked him. "What do you mean?" "I mean she's better, she's all the way better. You did the thing, what's it for?" I wasn't asking to be cruel, I genuinely wanted to know. "You've got a healthy buffalo on 40 acres of hardpan. You're not gonna eat her, you're not gonna sell her. What's the plan?" He was quiet for a while, the way he always got quiet before the true things. Junebug lifted her head and looked at us, chewing, and then went back to grazing. "I don't think it needs to be for anything," he said finally. "That was Ada's whole problem with the world, you know. Everybody always asking what things were for. She used to say," he stopped, started again. "She used to say some things are just for being alive. That was enough for her. A ladybug on a leaf. That was the whole point of a ladybug, far as she was concerned, being alive on a leaf." He turned the untouched beer in his hands. "I lost track of that after she died. Everything had to be for something, or I couldn't see the point of it. Couldn't see the point of much of anything, tell you the truth." He nodded out at the buffalo. "Junebug's not for anything," he said. "She's just alive on a leaf. That's the whole point of her." He almost smiled. "I think Ada sent her to remind me. I know that sounds crazy. I don't care, that's what I think." I didn't tell him it sounded crazy. I'd stopped believing it did. I'd been coming out to that barn for the better part of a summer, and I'd watched a $2 animal that should have been a rug turn into the reason. A grieving father started sleeping through the night again, and I was no longer certain where the line between crazy and true was supposed to go. I wrote one thing in my notebook that evening. I wrote, "Some things are just for being alive." Then I put the notebook away and we watched the buffalo graze until it got dark, 2 tired men and 1 impossible animal, and I drove home thinking the story was over. It wasn't over. It hadn't even gotten to the part I still can't explain. Because here is what I didn't know, sitting on that tailgate in the gold light. I didn't know that Dr. Ackerfer, on her last visit, had run a routine blood panel and sent it off almost as an afterthought. I didn't know what those results would show. I didn't know that the phone in Wesley's double-wide was going to ring on a Tuesday morning in September, and that Dr. Ackerfer's voice was going to be strange and careful on the other end, and that Wesley was going to have to sit down at his kitchen table with the receiver pressed hard against his ear. I didn't know that a $2 buffalo everyone had left for dead was carrying something inside her that none of us had seen. Something that had survived the starvation and the sickness and the winch and the long, slow crawl back from the edge. Something impossible. I found out the way I found out everything in those months. Wesley called me, and his voice was doing a thing I'd never heard it do, and he said, "You need to come out here. You need to see this. I can't even just come. Please, come now." I broke every speed limit on that forgotten county road. And what was waiting for me in Wesley Boone's barn, in the straw where a dying animal had once refused to die, is the part of this story I've told 100 times and still don't fully believe, even though I stood in that doorway and saw it with my own 2 eyes. There was a calf in the straw. That's the whole impossible thing in 5 words, and I've never found a better way to say it. When I skidded my truck to a stop outside Wesley's barn that September morning and half ran through the doorway with my heart going like a hammer, that's what I saw. Junebug standing in the light and pressed against her side, wobbly and wet dark and brand new to the world, a buffalo calf. I stopped so hard I nearly fell. She was pregnant, Wesley said. He was sitting in the straw a few feet away, keeping his distance so Junebug wouldn't fret, and he was crying without any shame at all, tears just running down into his beard while he grinned like a fool. She was pregnant the whole time. Doc's blood panel caught the hormones. When she was dying in that pen, she was already carrying it. It was inside her the whole time we were losing her. I couldn't speak. I want you to understand the arithmetic of what he was telling me, because it took me a moment to do the math myself, standing there in that doorway. The buffalo everyone left for dead at that auction had been pregnant, which meant that when Wesley raised his slow, uncertain hand and bid $2, he hadn't saved one life. He'd saved 2. The calf pressed against Junebug's flank had been 3-4 months along inside a starving, dying animal that 40 ranchers and 1 auctioneer, and God forgive me, 1 curious man with a notebook had all agreed wasn't worth a single dollar to save. If Wesley hadn't bid, if he'd gotten back in his truck like a sensible man, if any one of us had been right about that animal, the calf would have died in her, unborn, unseen, and none of us would ever have known there'd been anything there to lose. $2, 2 lives. I did the math a dozen times standing in that doorway, and it came out the same every time, and every time it took the wind out of me. The calf was a heifer, a little female. Junebug was cleaning her with long, slow strokes of her tongue, making a low sound in her chest I'd never heard her make before, a sound as old as buffalo, older, a sound that has been made on this continent since before there were people to hear it. She's healthy, Wesley said. Doc's on her way, but I got her breathing. I cleared her nose. She's nursing already. Look, his voice broke apart. Look at her. She's perfect. She's just perfect. I finally got my legs to work, and I came in slow, the way Wesley had taught me, and I sat down in the straw beside him. Neither of us said anything for a long time. We just watched the calf nurse and Junebug clean her, and the dust turn gold in the light through the barn boards, and I felt something happening in my chest that I did not have a notebook entry for, that I have never found the right words for since. "What are you gonna name her?" I finally asked. My voice came out rough. Wesley didn't answer right away. When he did, he wasn't looking at me. He was looking at the calf. "Ada," he said. And then he couldn't say anything else, and neither could I. And the 2 of us sat in that barn and wept like children, while a buffalo that everyone had left for dead nursed her impossible daughter in the straw. I've told this story a lot of times over the years, at the feed store, at funerals. Oddly, it's a story people want to hear at funerals. Once to a newspaper fella who wanted to write it up and got half of it wrong. And every single time, somebody says the same thing to me at the end. They say, "What a miracle." And I let them say it, because it's kind, and because they mean well, and because there's no arguing with a person who wants a miracle. But I want to tell you what I actually think now, at the end of this, because you stayed the whole way and you've earned the true version instead of the greeting card one. I don't think it was a miracle, not the way people mean. The calf being alive inside Junebug, that was just biology. Buffalo can carry a pregnancy through terrible hardship. The body protects the young at the mother's own expense. It's not magic. It's the oldest arrangement in the world. The pregnancy is probably part of why Junebug held on as long as she did in that pen, some deep animal refusal to quit while she was still carrying life. There's nothing supernatural in it. Here's the part I do think is a miracle, if the word means anything. 40 people looked at that dying animal and saw a rug, a cost, a problem to leave for someone else. I was one of them. I want to keep saying that because the story's no good if I make myself the exception. I looked at Junebug and did the same cold math everyone did, and the math said not worth it, and I believed the math. We all did. The math is almost always what people believe. And one grieving man, who had every reason in the world to be more broken and more selfish, and more careful with what was left of his heart than any of us. One man looked at the exact same dying animal and could not do the math. Would not. Raised his hand slow and scared and said $2, not because he thought he could save her, but because he thought somebody ought to sit with her so she wouldn't die alone. That's the miracle, not the calf. The hand going up, the refusal to leave. A man so hollowed out by loss that you'd forgive him anything, choosing for no reason, against all sense, at real cost to himself, to be the one person in that crowd who wouldn't look away. Everything else followed from that. The calf lived because Junebug lived because Wesley stayed. The whole impossible thing hangs on one broken man's decision not to be sensible. And I've come to believe that's where every real miracle I've ever heard of actually comes from, not from the sky, but from some ordinary wrecked person deciding to stay when leaving would have been so much easier. I should finish by telling you what happened to them, since you've come this far. Junebug is still alive as of this writing, getting on in years now but healthy, still hates the road grader, still follows Wesley around the paddock. Ada the calf grew up into a big strong cow of her own, and she had a calf 2 springs ago, and that calf had, well, you see where it goes. Wesley's 40 acres of hardpan and mesquite has a small buffalo herd on it now, every one of them descended from a $2 animal that was supposed to be a rug. He never sells them, never eats them. When people ask him what they're for, he tells them what Ada told him. Some things are just for being alive. Most people don't understand. He doesn't mind. Wesley himself is, I want to say healed, but that's not right because you don't heal from losing a child, not all the way, not ever. What I'll say instead is that he's living. All the way living in a way he wasn't when I met him kneeling in the mud beside a dying animal. He put Ada's photograph back in the house, eventually, off the barn wall, said Junebug didn't need reminding anymore, and neither did he. He laughs easy now. He sleeps. He got a dog. Small things. The kind of small things that mean a person has decided to stay in the world. As for me, I stopped leaving before the interesting part. That's the honest change in me, if there is one, and I lay it entirely at the door of that barn. 61 years I'd spent turning the truck around, and one dying buffalo and one stubborn grieving man taught me to stay for the ending. I still keep my notebook. I still write down the weather and the prices and the way a man holds his hat when he's lying. But I write down other things now too, the things you're supposed to just hold. I've decided a person can do both. I go out to Wesley's most weeks. We sit on the tailgate and watch the herd graze in whatever light the day's giving us, and we don't always talk, and it's the best part of my week and has been for years. Last time I was out there, one of the young ones, a great grand calf of Junebug's, all legs and curiosity, came right up to the fence and looked at me with those dark, wet eyes, and I found myself thinking about the auction, and the math, and the smell I couldn't scrub out, and how close the whole impossible thing came to never happening at all. $2, that's what all of this cost. That's what the world had priced it at. A dying animal, a father's grief, a calf no one knew was coming, a herd, a healing, a friendship, and whatever it is that finally taught an old man to stay. $2, and one hand going slowly up in a crowd that had already looked away. I think about that hand more than almost anything. I think I'll think about it until the day